are people from that army.
Who approved the orders? For years, members of the Bush administration have pointed fingers at each other. But for the first time, Paul Bremer gave me a clear answer to the question.
White House officials have variously kind of pinned the blame on you.
Not the president.
Not the president, but...
No, the president hasn't.
No.
Yeah, well, he approved them.
He approved?
Yes.
George Bush has never taken clear responsibility. But Bremer says the idea to fire Ba'ath Party members came from this man. Doug Feith was a key aide to Donald Rumsfeld at the Pentagon.
The decree was drafted and was ready to be signed before I left. In fact, the day before I left, Under Secretary of Defense Doug Feith showed me the draft and said, we're going to issue this tomorrow.
Paul Bremer says de-Ba'athification was your idea.
No, de-Ba'athification was something that was discussed interagency for months. And the decision was made that some degree of de-Ba'athification would be required. Ultimately, Bremer set up the mechanism for how the de-Ba'athification would be organized.
But it sure sounds like everyone's pointing their fingers at everybody
else. It does.
else.
A lot of the allegations are inaccurate.
Doug Feith also played a key role in the original mistake. The false pre-war intelligence that led to war. His office was tasked with looking at intelligence, some of which the CIA did not deem credible.
Good morning. The problem with the CIA was that it was sloppy over and over again.
Remember the intelligence George Bush asked for on the night of 9/11?
The president asked me, Saddam, go back, look at everything. Find whether or not Saddam was involved.
Doug Feith found some of what the president was asking for. A 2007 Pentagon investigation was highly critical of what he found and how he found it.
The Inspector General report says that effectively that your office was cherry-picking evidence and that was inappropriate.
No, the Inspector General never said that. What the Inspector General said, if you want to get into that, was...
developed, produced, and disseminated alternate intelligence assessments of the Iraq-Al-Qaeda relationship which were inconsistent with the consensus of the intelligence community.
That for sure. Yes, we disagreed with the intelligence community.
So did Dick Cheney. He was quick to blame the CIA.
When George Tenet sat in the Oval Office and the President of the United States to ask him directly, he said, George, how good is the case against Saddam and weapons of mass destruction? The director of the CIA said, it's a slam dunk, Mr. President, it's a slam dunk.
There has been no formal process to hold anyone accountable for the terrible misjudgments of the Iraq War. But one former administration official says they were more than just mistakes.
I think if you look at the technical definition of some war crimes, I think the United States committed war crimes.
There have been calls for war crime trials in England against former Prime Minister Tony Blair, George Bush's staunch ally and partner during the war. Blair is the only person we spoke to for this program who took responsibility for Iraq.
So I can say that I apologize for the fact that the intelligence we received was wrong. I can also apologize, by the way, for some of the mistakes in planning and certainly our mistake in our understanding of what would happen once you removed the regime. But I find it hard to apologize for removing Saddam. I think even from today in 2015, it is better that he's not there than that he is there.
Coming up next, the men who want to go back.
You gotta fight them. You gotta fight them.
And the enemy we could face.
Muhammad's army will come back in the future. Inshallah.
12.5 years after George Bush's dream began,
we will bring freedom to others, and we will prevail.
Iraqis are running for their lives. Tens of thousands of them desperate to escape ISIS. And many more fleeing Syria.
We're running now with these migrants and refugees.
all of them on a dangerous journey to reach Europe, to reach safety.
We hope to get Germany.
Governments there are struggling with how to handle the gigantic numbers. Some are closing their borders, or worse.
Okay, sorry. Okay, I can smell that tear gas now. They're chanting Allahu Akbar.
The risks the refugees take have become heartbreakingly clear. But still, they come. Because for many, the alternative is this. The most dangerous band of thugs the world has ever seen.
Our knife will continue to strike the necks of your people.
The beheadings, the mass murders, the rape and enslavement of women. All of it was born of the rage and chaos that have crippled the country since America first went into Iraq.
If it were not for the American invasion of Iraq and the subsequent disbanding of the Iraqi army by the United States, there would be no ISIS.
Now this is Camp Bucca.
Indeed, the seeds of ISIS grew at an American prison in the Iraqi desert. During the insurgency, the most dangerous jihadis were locked up at Camp Bucca. In 2004, one of them was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the future leader of ISIS.
He wasn't considered, from everything that we know now, a high-level detainee. And he was allowed to lead prayers, he was allowed to give religious lessons.
That's right. The US not only had al-Baghdadi in its custody, he was actually allowed to teach Islam to fellow inmates. By 2014, al-Baghdadi's ISIS was declaring itself a caliphate, an Islamic state. And across the world, young Muslims heard the call.
I'm your brother in Islam here in Syria. I originally come from Canada.
Please, all believers, come. Who can make it come?
Qu'attendez-vous? Qu'attendez-vous?
We want to get ISIS.
All of it has led to angry calls from the presidential campaign trail.
How does President Obama sleep at night?
From candidates who say it's time to go to war with ISIS.
If I'm President of the United States, we're going in on the ground and we're going to pull the caliphate up by its roots and we're going to kill every one of these bastards we can find, because if we don't, they're coming here. Let's get on with it.
Donald Trump is also urging combat. Here he is on 60 Minutes.
With ISIS in Iraq, you got to knock them out.
How do you do that?
You got to fight them. You got to fight them.
On
you
the
have
ground.
to send in. If you need, you're going to have to do that. Yes.
Troops on the ground.
Yes.
But go to war where? How? The Obama administration has struggled to fight ISIS without actually going into ground combat. 3,500 troops are on the ground, training Iraqi forces.
The Iraqi army abandoned its positions.
The same forces who had famously run from battle when confronted by ISIS.
The Iraqi army outnumbered ISIS 20 or 30 to 1 in Mosul, Iraq's second largest city, and it basically surrendered it without a fight.
Perhaps the most important question is, does it make sense to go to war again in a country that may not even be a country anymore? Listen to the people who know Iraq well.
Iraq doesn't exist except lines on a map.
Most Iraqis no longer see themselves as Iraqis. They see themselves as Shia, or they see themselves as Sunnis, or they see themselves as Kurds. And U.S. foreign policy, like it or not, probably has to adapt to a post-Iraqi era. I keep saying the Rand-McNally era of the Middle East has probably seen its day.
The map tells the story. Take a look. Up here in the north is the Kurdish area.
autonomous, largely self-governing, called Kurdistan. South of Baghdad are the Shiite areas. They comprise the majority of the country. In the middle, this large swath, 1/3 of Iraq, which then spills into Syria, is Sunni land. This is where ISIS has taken control. This is what it has turned into, a de facto Islamic state. Iraq ends here, but only on maps. The border between Iraq and Syria, drawn arbitrarily by the French and British after World War I, has now become meaningless. Disaffected Sunnis inhabit most of this area, and the Islamic State now controls large swaths of it as well. So any boots-on-the-ground fight against ISIS would likely have to be in both Iraq and Syria.
This is the aftermath of Russia's first airstrike in Syria.
Another twist. Vladimir Putin's military has joined the fight. It is now dropping bombs in Syria to support its ally, Bashar al-Assad. A chaotic picture. All of which leads back to one question. Can we fight ISIS in Iraq when there really is no Iraq left?
At the end of the day, Fareed, we can't put that country together.
And as Iraq falls apart, the blame game escalates. President Bush or President Obama?
The person I blame is Barack Obama, not George W. Bush.
When we return, the finger pointing versus the facts. What put Iraq in the precarious position it's in now? Was it the beginning, Bush's invasion, or the end, Obama's withdrawal?
We are here today because of the disastrous blunder of the Bush-Cheney era, which got us into this war in Iraq in the first place, which then developed the can of worms that we're trying to deal with right now.
When it comes to blaming people about Iraq, the person I blame is Barack Obama, not George W. Bush.
The American public is evenly split. 44% say it's Obama's fault, 43% say it's Bush's.
And the war in Iraq was unwise.
President Obama has said he was opposed to the Iraq war from the start. And when he ran for president in 2008, he made an important pledge.
When I am commander-in-chief, I will set a new goal on day one. I will end this war.
Less than 4 years later, a little slower than he had originally hoped, the last American combat soldier left Iraq. Bush administration Undersecretary of Defense Douglas Feith says Obama's withdrawal bolstered both Iran and ISIS.
The thing that gave them the greatest opportunity was when President Obama decided to quit. And we killed our influence in the country.
Obama official Antony Blinken says there's a slight hitch in Feith's argument. It wasn't Obama who set the withdrawal.
In 2008, President Bush negotiated a status of forces agreement with the government of Iraq. And it provided that the United States and its forces would leave Iraq by the end of 2011.
Many of the participants in this process say the Obama administration didn't try hard enough because at the end of the day, President Obama just wanted to get out.
At the end of the day, the Iraqis wanted us out. That's what happened.
Those Iraqis were led by Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki. He had come into office promising to heal the country's sectarian divide. Instead, he inflamed it. Maliki met frequently with David Petraeus when the general commanded all coalition forces in Iraq.
I'd love to have tested the proposition that 10,000 troops and a 3- or 4-star operational commander might have given us the kind of influence necessary to dissuade Prime Minister Maliki from some of the highly sectarian actions that he took.
10,000 troops. A plan to leave a force of that size had been floated in Washington and Baghdad. It was a plan that never came to fruition.
I don't know whether 10,000 troops would have given us the leverage. I suspect it might not have, but I would have liked to have tested the proposition.
It was never tested, some experts say, because of Prime Minister Maliki. The New Yorker's Dexter Filkins reported that after Iran made sure Maliki was re-elected Prime Minister in 2010, Maliki then turned around and did a favor for Iran. He promised to expel all American forces before 2011 was over. Now, back in 2006, it was George W. Bush who put Maliki in office in the first place. So, does Bush bear the blame? Richard Clark made a point earlier on in which he tells us what he thinks.
If it were not for the American invasion of Iraq and the subsequent disbanding of the Iraqi army by the United States, there would be no ISIS. I mean, ISIS is a direct outgrowth of the American invasion.
But Clark's former colleague, Douglas Feith, sticks to his guns.
If today you knew what we all know about what has happened in Iraq, would you, going back, have invaded Iraq? What's your answer?
Well, I think that the only meaningful way to approach that is to ask whether President Bush, knowing what he knew at the time, made the right decision, and I think he did.
Tony Blair, when he was Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, was Bush's most public partner on the Iraq War.
Of course, you can't say that those of us who removed Saddam in 2003 bear no responsibility for the situation in 2015.
But Blair still wonders what was the alternative.
We have tried intervention and putting down troops in Iraq. We've tried intervention without putting in troops in Libya. And we've tried no intervention at all but demanding regime change in Syria. Right? It's not clear to me that even if our policy did not work, subsequent policies have worked better.
Bush or Obama? Well, maybe there's another party to blame for the sad state of Iraq and the region.
What's happened in the Middle East is in part the result of things we've done, like the Iraq War, and things we haven't done, like Syria, or things we've done, like Libya. There's any number of acts of commission and omission, which historians will rightly take the United States and others to task for. But what's missing from this analysis is also local responsibility. This is a deeply flawed part of the world that it never came to terms with modernity.
Next on GPS, from blame to credit. George W. Bush is rightly lauded for the one somewhat shining moment of hope in the entire Iraq debacle. Inside the surge, when we come back. The U.S.-led war on Iraq started more than 4,600 days ago. The vast majority of those days have been filled with bloody and deadly violence. But there was a period of hope, a time when the bloodshed and violence abated. That brief period had its beginnings in some of the darkest days of despair. January 10th, 2007. President George W. Bush goes before the American people to talk about the war effort.
It is clear that we need to change our strategy in Iraq. The most urgent priority for success in Iraq is security.
Almost exactly a month later,
Marhaba Shabab. Assalamu alaikum.
General David Petraeus arrives in Baghdad after being named the new U.S. commander in Iraq. He had already done 2 long tours of duty in country. But what he sees this time around, almost 4 years after the war started, was disturbing and different.
First day and full day in command was traveling around Baghdad to see the situation there, which frankly was really quite horrifying. I'd known these neighborhoods as thriving, bustling, prosperous areas. In some cases, they're completely blown up. The people had moved out. In one case, it was almost metaphorical. There's literally tumbleweed blowing down this empty road.
The president had decided Iraq needed an influx of American troops to secure the peace. Petraeus had a plan to do just that.
You mind if I ask what you do for a living?
And it started with this.
The only way to secure the people, the only way to ensure security is to live with them, to be in the neighborhood 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
The general says this tactic was the exact opposite of what the United States had been doing in the prior months, pulling out of the cities and towns and neighborhoods of Iraq and retreating to massive U.S. bases.
Let's go, move it!
In Petraeus' parlance, the new policy was once a town was cleared of its malevolent forces, the next step was to hold it, with American troops staying there in the town amongst the Iraqi civilians to make sure that the bad guys didn't come back. The other interesting innovation of the early surge was even more controversial. He needed to find a way to stop the Sunni insurgents from killing American troops and Iraqi civilians. They were in open rebellion against the government.
We had to give them incentives to support the new Iraq.
The idea was to give the Sunnis a piece of the pie.
Iraq has a bounty of energy resources and water, the land of the two rivers, great farmland. It's got incredible natural blessings, and they want to have their share of that.
Petraeus and his commanders quickly turned that around by hiring those Sunni militias to work for them. The militias would now be paid to protect the very same groups of people they had been killing.
We made the sheikhs, each were contractors, and we would contract with them for fixed site security, just as we did with international security firms.
Those tactics and many others made the military surge work.
I think during the 19.5 months that I was privileged to command the multinational force in Iraq, violence went down by 80 or 85%. I mean, it was incredible.
It was incredible until it stopped working, which it did as the United States began pulling back. Coming up, my thoughts on the lessons of America in Iraq.
I've taken you down memory lane in this last hour, reminding you of all the choices made and their consequences. So what do I make of it all? Well, let me first be honest with you and tell you what I made of it all at the time. I was in favor of the Iraq War. I believed that a modern democracy in Iraq could be a new model of politics for the region, a middle ground between repressive dictatorships and Islamic fanaticism. And I never believed that Iraqis or Arabs were somehow genetically incapable of self-rule. Now, I did urge that the US needed to send in many more troops than it did so that it could maintain order. I urged a UN mandate to provide greater legitimacy and avoid the image of an American occupation of a Muslim Middle Eastern country. I worried that Iraq's sectarian divisions would pull the country apart, but it doesn't change the fact that I did support the decision to topple Saddam Hussein's regime. Some good came of it. Saddam was a gruesome dictator who killed hundreds of thousands and plunged his country into wars. Iraq is now more free and open than almost any other Arab country, despite its troubles. Kurdistan is a real success story, an oasis of stability, modernity, and tolerance. But in the end, the Iraq War was a failure and a terrible mistake, causing geopolitical chaos and humanitarian tragedy. Millions of Iraqis were displaced. At least 150,000 civilians died, in addition to the almost 4,500 brave American soldiers. Some argue that one can overlearn the lessons of Iraq. Sure, but my caution about a larger American intervention in Syria or elsewhere derives not just from Iraq. Consider this. The United States replaced the regime in Iraq and gave the new one massive assistance for a decade. The result, chaos and humanitarian tragedy. Washington toppled the regime in Libya but chose not to attempt nation building in that country. The result has been chaos and humanitarian tragedy. Washington supported a negotiated removal of the regime in Yemen and the election that followed, but generally took a back seat. The result, chaos and humanitarian tragedy. The reality in that part of the world is that many of its regimes are fragile, presiding over weak institutions, little civil society, and often no sense of nationhood itself. In that situation, outside interventions, however well-meaning, might not make things better. Sometimes they can even make things worse. Could Iraq have turned out differently and set a different pattern if a stable, functioning democracy had been established in the heart of the Middle East? Could it have been a model for the region, a third way between dictatorship and Islamic radicalism? Well, if America had made all the right decisions, who knows? But it didn't. And as a result, we will never truly know. Thanks for watching. I'm Fareed Zakaria.